Hi, I'm Marcin Kuśmierczyk. Welcome to Eastern Insights. Why does Eastern Europe's perspective on global affairs matter? Because here, history and geopolitics collide in ways that shape our world. Yet these voices often go unheard. This podcast bridges this gap. Each episode translates in-depth analysis from my Polish YouTube channel, Polityka Zagraniczna, which means international politics. For the last few years, this platform has dissected foreign policy, security, and the forces shaping Eastern Europe. Using AI tools like 11 Labs, we adapt these nuanced insights into English, preserving their depth while making them accessible to all. Whether we're unpacking Russia's latest moves, EU debates, or security challenges in Central Europe, our mission is simple: to foster informed dialogue by sharing Eastern Europe's untold stories. If you're curious about the world beyond headlines, subscribe now. Join me as we decode the complexities of global affairs, one Eastern European insight at a time.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. So, the European Union recently struck a trade deal with the United States, and let me tell you, it's caused quite a stir. We're talking about a significant portion of European political and economic commentators experiencing what I'd call spasms of anger and embarrassment over this. And all of this, interestingly enough, followed a pretty fruitless EU-China summit. These past few days really feel like the culmination of a great game for the economic future of the world. More precisely, it's about Europe's place in that global landscape, and honestly, a lot of signs point to Europe remaining a junior partner to the United States. This isn't just about trade or economics either, it's a broader political alignment. You know, today, Donald Trump is out there playing golf, maybe in Scotland, with Ursula von der Leyen, squeezing in some policy discussions between rounds. Now, let's talk about international trade. Since April of this year, it's been a non-stop roller coaster. Things are constantly happening, new actions are being taken, but it all stems from the United States. They're really the driving force behind this entire process. Why? Because Americans want to stop being the nation, the country, that simply accepts the production surplus from every other participant in the global exchange of goods and services. The U.S. wants to change the very character of its economy, its orientation regarding the global trade system. And we've discussed the mechanisms behind this shift in many of our previous episodes. Europe's attitude toward all this confusion, at least initially, seemed to be full of expectations. Europe kind of pretended that American threats weren't affecting them because, you know, they could always just initiate intensive trade cooperation with other partners. Well, that attempt to establish a partnership with the People's Republic of China ended in disaster. The EU-China summit, which happened on July 24th in Beijing, was a long-awaited event. But frankly, it had been clear for a while that it wouldn't bring any breakthrough results. In fact, you can sum up that meeting in very few words. First and foremost, the Chinese clearly underestimated the European Union. The way European leadership was received there was a pretty clear, demonstrative show to Europe that these relations aren't exactly overflowing with mutual respect. And then, the rather miserable nature of this meeting was, in my opinion, drowned in a sea of non-connecting slogans, primarily about climate. Ultimately, nothing concrete was established. And if you've been following this series, you know I'm not particularly surprised by this turn of events. This is because, in my opinion, the community of interests between Europe and China in international trade is nothing more than an illusion, a delusion, a misunderstanding of the situation. Thoughtful. Here's why. Yes, Europe and China have, or had, a similar attitude towards the previous economic order. Both were export-focused economies, holding an advantage in international trade exports. And for both China and Europe, the primary export market is the United States. This makes it seem like, in this scenario, China and Europe are playing on the same team because they should both strive to maintain the current trade exchange system as it benefits them. And both these economies, Europe to a lesser extent, China to a greater extent, are dependent on the existence of this trade exchange system. The only problem is, if America changes its attitude towards exports, then everything changes. Because if Americans no longer want to absorb the production of others, then everyone who is focused on export suddenly becomes rivals in the hunt for new exchange markets. The Chinese, for instance, must aggressively search for new markets for their production today. They won't want to let in European competition. In fact, they'll want to penetrate the European market themselves in new industries. And this is precisely what the European Trade Commissioner has been saying. We cannot allow Chinese subsidies, illegal support of Chinese companies, and aggressive acquisition of other markets to do to other industries what they did, for example, to the photovoltaic industry. That's what the European Trade Commissioner said just 2 days ago. The very same man, after meeting with the Chinese, or after this visit of the European delegation to China, led by Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel, both the head of the European Council and the head of the European Commission. Well, after this meeting, the Trade Commissioner, Maroš Šefčovič, who is Slovakian, said that Europe went on this trip expecting the Chinese to make at least symbolic concessions on trade. But the Chinese didn't budge an inch.
In this situation, Europe, which tried to play on two pianos, found itself in a position where it was impossible to reach any trade agreements with China. This meant they had to urgently seek some agreement with the Americans to avoid a long-term trade war, which would introduce a huge dose of uncertainty into the European market, into European business. And the Americans understood this situation perfectly, and they exploited it indiscriminately. I think it's worth taking a moment to discuss the symbolic and political dimension of this event. Ursula von der Leyen and Donald Trump announced what they called the largest trade agreement in the history of the world. And the conditions under which this announcement was made, they just contrasted so sharply with those grand words. It was really done on the sidelines of a golf tournament where Donald Trump was participating. Of course, he was there for political reasons, and other political meetings took place. But for the largest trade agreement in the history of the world, that entourage just didn't fit at all. As you know, on this program, I don't typically place much importance on appearances, what someone looked like, their facial expressions, their entourage, or the overall demeanor of this or that politician. I prefer to focus on more concrete matters. But in this specific case, it truly stings the eye. Ursula von der Leyen also published a video where she talks about the assumptions of this agreement from a European perspective. And she presents them in such a gloomy way that she didn't even manage to create the illusion that it was truly some kind of European success, or that she genuinely considered it a great achievement. But the worst part, in my opinion, was when Trump and von der Leyen presented these common assumptions at the same time. This meeting was completely dominated by the Americans. Poor Ursula, at some point, she even started talking like Trump. In any case, the whole deal was presented primarily by Trump, and unambiguously from an American perspective. This led to a pretty obvious question being posed to Ursula von der Leyen when it was time for a few questions. What are the American concessions here? Because, from all appearances, it looked like one great, spectacular American success. So the question had to come, what's in this for Europe? Where did the Americans compromise? What are the European successes?
And Ursula von der Leyen's answer, it's truly fascinating. Because the head of the European Commission, in response to this question, stated that the European goal was something that, in reality, is clearly the American goal. After all, in this trade relationship, Europe holds a trade surplus. With no other country in the world does the European Union as a whole have as much trade surplus as it does with the United States. It's crucial to emphasize this at every turn. So it's not Europe that depends on balancing this relationship. From the perspective of European interest in these negotiations, her statement makes absolutely no sense. But this is exactly what the Americans currently want to hear from the Europeans. The entire tone of this event leaves no doubt as to whose point of view was the starting point here. I mean, who dominated this negotiation? Europe, which seemed so hard-nosed and assertive, ends this process by 100% subordinating itself to a new economic paradigm that the Americans are imposing. However, not only the form of this agreement, but also its content is problematic. And it's problematic on several levels. But you can also draw a few very important conclusions from this.
The problem is that it's not entirely clear what was actually decided. Both the European and American versions of this agreement, presented rhetorically, differ in detail. For example, Europe spoke about zero tariffs on a number of strategic industries and goods, something the Americans didn't mention. In terms of steel, Europe talked about new import quotas and lower tariff rates, again, something the Americans didn't say. There's a big communication mess here. But once again, what does this stem from? It comes from the fact that it was also a battle over who would present it as their victory. The Americans definitely dominated. But it's also a result of this agreement not being a detailed, carefully negotiated, multi-page, 1,000-page trade agreement, the kind European officials specialize in. This is actually an agreement that some would call a political compulsion. It's a political agreement, not a trade agreement, and we'll get to that in a moment. As for the actual economic results of this agreement, I would divide them into two categories: target rates and bizarre, other commitments. The target rates, while there are some deviations from the norm, are generally unequal. That is, the Americans are imposing 15% tariffs on European products and not introducing symmetrical actions in relation to America. But my biggest surprise is the whole range of other bizarre commitments undertaken by the European Commission. For example, the European Commission committed to America that Europe will buy more American military equipment. It also committed to the fact that Europe will buy American raw materials worth $750 billion in 3 years. Now, the discussion is whether this is even possible. And the European Commission also committed that private European companies will invest $600 billion in America. $600 billion. The European Commission promised the Americans such investments from European companies. But among all these issues, or in relation to all these issues, you have to ask one very important question. On what basis? That is, how does the European Commission intend to oblige private European companies to invest at such a level in the United States? The European Commission has no mandate to undertake such commitments. It does not have a mandate to dispose of the private resources of European companies in this way. This is, to say the least, a bit surprising. Of course, I wasn't the only one asking myself, what is this all about? And when these questions finally reached the European Commission, their representatives had to admit, yes, the European Commission does not have the tools to deliver on such promises. And this is a bit curious, because in this case, I, as Donald Trump, would say, what's 600? I'll give you 800. $800 billion of private European investments until the end of next year. I guarantee you that. And the fact that I don't have the tools to deliver on this promise, well, I'll just admit it tomorrow. It's truly strange. Of course, I'm being a little facetious here, but this once again emphasizes the not quite commercial formal, but rather the more political status character of this whole agreement. As I said at the beginning, there was a wave of criticism against this agreement. There are some dissenting voices, of course, but the criticism has been quite sharp. France reacted most sharply. The Prime Minister of that country stated that this is an act of subordination to the United States and a black day in the history of Europe. So the European Commission has to defend itself somehow. How do they explain this type of agreement? It's worth noting that there are politicians in Europe associated with the establishment around the European Commission who support this point of view. And it's not entirely devoid of rationality. A slightly wider context for this agreement was again built by the Trade Affairs Commissioner, Maroš Šefčovič, who said something that many people trying to understand what is happening in this area will appreciate. He said directly that it's necessary to take into account that the world from April of this year no longer exists, and that we live in completely new conditions. And in these new circumstances, he argued, this was the best agreement that could be negotiated in these very, very difficult circumstances. He didn't say it directly, but he made it clear that, yes, this is a bad agreement, but it's far better than an even worse alternative, which would be at least 30% worse and a further trade war, along with resulting political tensions. In other words, the Europeans who negotiated this matter with the Americans are telling us that the Americans genuinely want to rebalance international trade, and they will strive for this with hard tools. And in such conditions, entering into an agreement with America, while Europe still has a trade surplus, would be extremely dangerous from Europe's point of view. This speech at the press conference after signing the agreement, already in Brussels, showed very clearly how little room for maneuver Europe had in these negotiations. Of course, they could have pushed for a draw, but that draw, in their calculations, turned out to be much worse than even this bad agreement. But there's something else the Commissioner noticed, and this, to me, seems to be the key to the whole assessment of this matter. Because the man said that this agreement cannot be assessed only as a trade agreement, he explained that in these negotiations, especially at the last stage, broad geopolitical issues were taken into account. He even used the word geopolitical, mentioning, for example, the war in Ukraine. And he stated that now, when we have tensions resulting from the trade war, we can go hand in hand with the Americans in a number of other strategic areas. And this to me seems to be the key to the future and the key to understanding what really happened here. Because from the NATO summit, after the trade agreement with Europe, that is, from matters related to trade security, we can see how, step by step, Europe is being subordinated to a new perspective and to American leadership. Transatlantic relations are changing in a very drastic way because Europe is accepting its dependence on the United States and accepting new conditions demanded by the Americans.
Europeans, of course, will judge it very differently. In places where values like sovereignty or status are extremely important, like in Paris, for example, such a process must arouse very emotional reactions. But there will also be those who will say that this is finally the realization of European policy, that their previous stance was a ridiculous artificial policy, where Europe tried to maintain an equal distance between China and the United States, especially considering strategic conditions, a war just beyond Europe's borders, and their dependence on trade, technology, social media, and every other sphere. Perhaps, in fact, this is simply accepting realities imposed by the United States. Because this whole sequence of political actions by Donald Trump's administration against Europe did bring results. It worked. From, to put it colloquially, the entry of J.D. Vance into this relationship in Munich, through rhetorically beating Europeans and equating them with the ground, through flirting with Moscow, clearly pulling Russia out of political isolation to then wave at the Russians and the Europeans and say, annoyed, here are our security priorities, here are our trade priorities, and please be careful because you never know. Then, through later spreading the trade war, and despite all the rebuttals, showing a determination to sometimes, even at a short-term cost to one's own credibility, one's own economy, to strive for certain goals, all of this means that after half a year into Donald Trump's presidency in his second term, we have a very visible symbolic political, economic, and rhetorical subordination of Europeans to Americans. From Mark Rutte's rather servile attitude as NATO Secretary General at the time of the NATO summit, and generally the tone of the NATO summit, which evidently went under the dictation of the new American administration, to the trade agreement, after which Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, publicly states that the European goal was to balance the trade relationship with America. The problem with Trump, of course, is that he arouses powerful emotions. So the assessment of his achievements, his behavior, is always somehow emotionally overshadowed. Either you like him very much, or you don't like him very much. Or each of his behaviors is a great spectacular success or a complete failure. But it's not so simple, of course. It's a balance. And while it's difficult to say in relation to China that America would be able to break China, they played Europe concert-like for a few months. There were more levers of pressure, there were more elements that the Americans could use, primarily because of the war, but this process also externalized what everyone in Europe actually knows, the weakness of the European political system. Because in the end, Ursula von der Leyen was sitting opposite Trump, and in this relationship, it was like a predator sitting in one room with its prey, and playing with food before it was eaten. Now, in my opinion, the absolutely key issue for the near future is the scope of this political understanding that is in the background of this trade agreement. Because if the effect of this agreement will be a more united transatlantic front, in which the Americans will support Europe, for example, when it comes to stopping the Russian Federation, then the balance of profits and costs resulting from what happened will be completely different than if we only calculated such or other target rates. This is something that needs to be paid attention to now, because this is of course a trade agreement, it concerns trade, but it clearly fits into much wider political phenomena, and it's important to see what this whole political phenomenon will lead us to in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very much for your attention today. We'll see you next time.